curious thrill-seekers drawn to the sprawling mansion of a reclusive billionaire. But this girl wasn't moving. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. Michael sighed heavily. It was late, and he had no patience for this kind of thing. Turning on his heel, he started toward the front door. Let the rain do its job and scare her off. He had no reason to care, no obligation to involve himself in someone else's problems. "Wait," she called out, her voice breaking. "Please." "You can sleep in the basement," he said abruptly, hating the words as they left his mouth. Her expression didn't shift, but she nodded and took a hesitant step forward. He unlocked the gate with deliberate slowness, each click of the mechanism giving him time to reconsider. But the girl's presence tugged at something he'd buried a long time ago. As she stepped through the gates, her small figure barely visible against the storm, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that letting her in was a mistake. He locked the gate behind her and gestured toward the side entrance, where the path led down to the basement. "No wandering," he said, his voice sharp again. "Just one night." For a moment, he considered calling her back, demanding answers about why she was there, but he pushed the thought away. It was just one night. In the morning, she'd be gone. But as Michael returned to his study, pouring himself a glass of whiskey to drown the tension curling in his chest, a nagging thought refused to leave him. She hadn't flinched when he mentioned the basement. Most people avoided it. Margaret's things were still down there. Michael stood by the window in his study, watching the rain streak against the glass. The storm seemed endless, mirroring the unease clawing at his mind. His whiskey sat untouched on the mahogany table, the amber liquid catching faint glimmers of the lightning outside. He couldn't shake the image of the girl's face, her eyes so piercing yet void of the usual pleading he'd seen in others. It wasn't gratitude, it was something else entirely. Downstairs, Emma had found a corner of the basement to settle into. The space was cluttered with relics of another life, a life Michael had buried alongside Margaret. The girl dragged the edge of her blanket across the floor, leaving faint trails in the dust. A large trunk sat against the wall, its brass hinges dulled with time. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between it and the shelves lined with old books and photo frames. She didn't touch anything, not yet. Instead, she sat on the cold floor and wrapped the tattered blanket tighter around her shoulders, her small body dwarfed by the cavernous room. The storm outside rumbled like a restless beast, but Emma didn't flinch. Her eyes lingered on the trunk. Michael paced his study. "One night," he muttered to himself, the words bitter in his mouth. He thought about Margaret and her endless insistence on charity, her belief that everyone deserved a second chance. It had been her passion, not his. He didn't share her idealism, and he certainly didn't want it walking back into his life in the form of a stray child. Hours passed. The storm eased into a steady drizzle, but Michael couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at him. He couldn't quite name it, a strange feeling that leaving the girl in the basement was wrong. He tried to push the thought aside, tried to convince himself it didn't matter, but it wouldn't leave him. Giving up on rest, he descended the grand staircase, his steps heavy against the hardwood floor. The air grew colder as he reached the basement door. It was a strange sensation, as if the space beyond had held its breath in his absence. He pushed the door open, and his eyes immediately landed on the girl. Emma was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at an old photo frame she must have taken from one of the shelves. She didn't seem startled when Michael appeared, didn't even look guilty. Her calmness unnerved him. "Put that back," Michael barked, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Emma didn't flinch. Instead, she turned the frame slightly, angling it toward him. "She was beautiful," she said softly, her small fingers tracing the edges of the frame. Her eyes were kind. Her smile in the picture was one he hadn't seen in years. The sight of it made something inside him twist painfully. He snatched the frame from Emma's hands. "I told you not to touch anything." The floor beneath him felt unsteady, as if the room itself were tilting. He shook his head, refusing to believe what he was hearing. That's impossible. He had supported her financially, yes, but he'd never asked for details. He hadn't cared to. Now, standing in the presence of this child who seemed to know more about his wife than he did, he felt an unfamiliar sting of regret. "Go to sleep," he said gruffly, stepping back toward the door. "You leave in the morning." Back in his study, he placed the photo frame on his desk, the glass fogged by his fingerprints. Margaret's smile stared back at him, a haunting reminder of the secrets she'd taken to her grave. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel alone in his grief. He felt betrayed. The storm outside had calmed, but inside the mansion another storm was brewing, one Michael couldn't ignore. It churned with unanswered questions, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he was ready to face the answers. The early morning sunlight seeped through the edges of the heavy curtains in Michael's study, but the warmth did nothing to ease the cold knot in his chest. He hadn't slept. The photo frame of Margaret still sat on his desk, her smile haunting him with unspoken questions. Downstairs he heard movement. The girl was awake. Michael didn't rush to check on her. He needed a moment to gather himself, to decide how to approach her now that her presence in his home had shifted from inconvenient to deeply unsettling. He couldn't deny the gnawing curiosity. The girl had spoken Margaret's name with a conviction that made his heart stutter. But how could that be possible? Margaret had never mentioned her, and Michael had been sure he knew all the faces of her work, at least peripherally. Finally, after reheating the coffee he hadn't touched the night before, he descended the stairs toward the basement. The door creaked open, and he found Emma sitting on the floor again, her blanket folded neatly beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but expectant. "Get up," he said gruffly, nodding toward the staircase. "Kitchen." The house had a stillness to it that felt unnatural, broken only by the muffled sound of Emma's shoes tapping lightly against the floor. Michael gestured to a chair at the small breakfast table, and she sat quietly, watching him move toward the counter. "You hungry?" he asked, already pulling bread from the pantry. He didn't wait for her answer before shoving slices into the toaster. "Yes," she said simply, her tone devoid of hesitation. He turned back, leaning against the counter as he crossed his arms. "How do you know Margaret?" "She didn't tell you," Emma said, her voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Michael bristled. "She didn't tell me everything about her projects," he admitted, his tone clipped. "But that doesn't explain why she'd visit a shelter there, or why you seem to think you knew her." He wanted to dismiss the girl's words, to accuse her of lying or making assumptions, but the steadiness in her tone made him hesitate. The toaster popped, startling him out of his thoughts. He turned back to the counter, placing the toast on a plate and setting it in front of her. "You expect me to believe that my wife, Margaret Carter, just happened to visit your shelter regularly without mentioning it to anyone? Without leaving any record?" She tore a piece off the toast and chewed slowly, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she swallowed and said, "I think she didn't tell you because she didn't want you to worry." Was there something about this one, about Emma, that she'd felt the need to keep hidden? Emma seemed to sense his turmoil, her gaze softening slightly. "I don't think she thought you'd understand," she added quietly. Michael pushed off the counter, pacing the kitchen as frustration bubbled inside him. "You don't know me," he snapped, "and you didn't know my wife. Not really. You don't get to stand there and tell me what she thought." She merely picked at her toast, her eyes downcast. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. "But she helped me. She made me feel safe, and she promised she'd be back." "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "None of this makes sense." The woman he'd loved had been compassionate, yes, but she'd never kept secrets from him, or so he'd thought. Finally, he turned back to Emma. "Finish your breakfast," he said gruffly, "then we'll figure out where you're going." He needed answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready for the truths they might reveal. Michael stood in the doorway of his late wife's office, a space he hadn't stepped into since Margaret's death. The room carried an air of abandonment, dust motes floating in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through partially closed curtains. Her desk, once meticulously organized, was now a graveyard of papers and unopened mail. For the first time in years, Michael felt compelled to sift through it. Emma's words echoed in his mind. She didn't tell you because she didn't want you to worry. It stung. The implication that Margaret hadn't trusted him enough to share this part of her life. As he approached the desk, his hands trembled slightly. He pulled open the top drawer and found her familiar stationery, a soft cream color with her name embossed at the top. Beneath it, notebooks were stacked haphazardly, their corners dog-eared. Michael hesitated before picking one up. The notebook's pages were filled with Margaret's elegant handwriting, notes scribbled in the margins and underlined passages. It detailed a project she'd been working on in secret, a network of shelters for at-risk children. Michael's heart sank as he realized the scope of her work, the depth of her dedication to a cause she hadn't shared with him. One name appeared repeatedly: Rose Haven Shelter, Portland. He leaned back in her chair, letting the notebook fall onto the desk. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Margaret hadn't just helped at shelters, she had been personally involved. She had been visiting these places, speaking with children like Emma, making promises she might not have had time to fulfill. Michael rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. How had he missed this? He'd been so absorbed in his own grief, his own life, that he hadn't noticed what was right in front of him. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to find Emma standing in the hallway, her small frame illuminated by the light from the windows. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Emma hesitated. "I was looking for you," she said softly. "I thought you might want to know more about her." She perched on the edge of the chair, her gaze flitting around the office before settling on the notebook in front of him. "She always wrote things down," Emma said. "She said it helped her think." His breath caught. There it was, proof that Margaret had intended to do something significant for this child. "She promised you a home," Michael murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She was trying to make good on that." For the first time, he saw her not as an intrusion, but as a tether to Margaret's unfinished work. "Why didn't you tell me all of this last night?" Michael asked, his tone softer now. Emma shrugged. "You didn't seem like you wanted to know." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice steady but low. "From the beginning. Most people came to drop things off and leave. She stayed." He didn't doubt the sincerity of Margaret's promise, but the fact that she'd taken on so much alone filled him with both pride and anger. She hadn't needed to carry that burden without him. She shouldn't have. "I need to see this place," Michael said abruptly, standing from the desk. Emma looked up at him, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" Michael gathered the notebook and slid it into his pocket. The weight of it felt both comforting and overwhelming. "Go get ready," he told her. "We leave in an hour." The engine of Michael's black SUV hummed as they pulled out of the long driveway. Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small hands folded in her lap, the oversized seatbelt looking almost comical on her slight frame. Michael kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as the city faded behind them. He had spent years avoiding the unfamiliar roads that Margaret used to travel. Now, each passing mile felt like a step deeper into a world he'd never tried to understand. Rosehaven was 2 hours away, nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland. It wasn't far, but the weight of the journey stretched the distance. The silence in the car was thick, neither of them willing to break it. Michael's mind raced with questions he wasn't ready to ask. Who else had Margaret helped? How much had she kept hidden? And why did he feel like he was the one intruding on her world, even now? Finally, Emma spoke, her voice tentative. "You're really going to Rosehaven? You don't seem like the type." Michael slowed the car, his grip on the wheel tightening as the shelter came into view. Rosehaven was unassuming, a modest brick building with a faded sign above the entrance. A small playground sat off to the side, its swings creaking gently in the breeze. Michael parked the car and turned off the engine, staring at the building with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "This is it," Emma said softly, her voice almost reverent. Michael nodded, but didn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he opened the door and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. Emma followed, her movements cautious as if she was stepping into a sacred space. As they approached the entrance, the door opened and a middle-aged woman stepped out. She wore a warm smile that faded slightly when her eyes landed on Michael. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm Michael Carter," he said, extending a hand. "My wife, Margaret, was involved with this place." Claire's gaze shifted to Emma, her expression turning gentle. "Emma, I remember you. Margaret talked about you all the time." Claire led them to a small office and gestured for them to sit. She opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder labeled Margaret Carter. Inside, he found detailed notes in Margaret's handwriting, sketches of programs she'd envisioned, and lists of children she'd worked with. Emma's name appeared more than once, circled and underlined. "She was working on adopting you," Claire said gently, addressing Emma. "She wanted to make sure you had a home." Michael felt a pang of guilt, the weight of Margaret's unfinished promise pressing down on him. "She never told me any of this," Michael said, his voice low. "Why?" He flipped through the folder, the pages blurring together as his mind raced. "I want to finish what she started," he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. Claire looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "That's a big commitment," she said, "but I think Margaret would have wanted that." He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing. Margaret had believed in this work, and he owed it to her and to Emma to see it through. As they left Rosehaven, Michael felt a strange sense of clarity. The questions that had haunted him since Margaret's death were beginning to take shape, and for the first time in years, he felt a purpose beyond his grief. The drive back to Seattle was quieter than the journey to Rosehaven. Emma sat silently, staring out the window as the trees blurred past, her small hands pressed tightly against her lap. Michael glanced at her occasionally, trying to make sense of the girl sitting beside him and the role she now seemed to play in his late wife's life. The folder from Rosehaven sat on the center console between them, its contents heavy with promises Margaret had made but never fulfilled. Each page Michael had read felt like a window into a part of Margaret he hadn't known, a side of her that had carried the weight of children like Emma without ever asking for help. "You're quiet," Michael said, his voice breaking the silence. Emma shrugged without turning to look at him. "What's there to say? But I didn't think it would be like that. I didn't think someone like her, someone like you, would ever do something like that." "She was serious about you," Michael said after a long pause. "She didn't make promises she didn't intend to keep." Notes about Emma stood out, detailing her background, her struggles, and Margaret's plans to provide her with a stable home. Michael's chest tightened as he read. Margaret had poured so much into this, and yet she had kept it hidden from him. He had been blind to the depth of her work, content to let her shoulder the burden alone while he stayed focused on his business empire. Now, faced with the evidence of her compassion and her sacrifices, he felt a profound sense of guilt. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice rougher than he intended. Emma stepped into the study hesitantly, her eyes flicking toward the papers scattered across the desk. "I didn't mean to bother you," she said quietly. "I just wanted to know what you're going to do." She wouldn't have stopped. He had built his empire on that skill. Now, for the first time, he felt compelled to use it for something more meaningful. "I'll need help," he said finally, looking back at Emma. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Claire can help. The people at Rosehaven, they know what to do, for the promise that had been left behind." That night, as Michael sat alone in his study, he picked up the photo of Margaret that had been sitting on his desk since Emma first arrived. He traced the edge of the frame with his finger, his heart heavy with both grief and determination. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I didn't know what you were doing, but I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make it right." The next morning, Michael woke earlier than he had in years. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint orange glow over the mansion. The air was crisp, and the house, as always, was quiet, save for the faint creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet as he made his way downstairs. Emma was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of toast in her hands. Her eyes lifted to meet his as he entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. The strange partnership between them was still fragile, tethered only by Margaret's memory and the promise that now weighed on both of them. "I have calls to make," Michael said, breaking the silence as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "If I'm going to do this, I need to understand what it takes to get something like Rosehaven running properly." Michael wondered what was going through her mind, but decided against pressing. There was too much to do to get distracted by feelings, his or hers. He took his coffee to his study and set to work. The folder from Rosehaven was still spread across his desk, its contents a mix of inspiration and intimidation. Michael opened his laptop, pulled up his contacts, and started making calls. He reached out to lawyers, financial advisors, and even a few non-profit leaders he had met at Margaret's charity events. The conversations were a mix of encouragement and caution. One of the calls was to Claire. "I was hoping I'd hear from you," Claire said warmly when she answered. "How can I help? Can I?" He was doing it because he couldn't bear the thought of Margaret's efforts ending in failure. "What do I need to know?" he pressed. Claire walked him through the basics, the funding, the permits, the staff, and the endless bureaucracy that came with running a shelter. It was daunting, but Michael took detailed notes, his mind already racing with plans. When he hung up, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the long list of tasks he had jotted down. It was overwhelming, but it was also familiar. This was what he did, taking chaos and turning it into order, building something out of nothing. The difference now was the stakes. This wasn't about profit margins or market dominance. This was about people, children like Emma, whose lives depended on his ability to succeed. By midday, Michael had drafted a rough plan. He would start by visiting Rosehaven again, this time with a clearer sense of what needed to be done. He would meet with the staff, learn from their experiences, and see firsthand how the shelter operated. From there, he would begin the process of expanding their reach, ensuring that Margaret's vision was realized. He called Emma into the study, and she appeared in the doorway, her small frame almost lost in the oversized sweater she wore. "What?" she asked, her tone cautious. "I'm going back to Rosehaven tomorrow," Michael said. "I want you to come with me." "You would have done this better," he murmured to the empty garden. "You always knew how to make things grow." She was holding the tattered notebook Margaret had given her, its pages worn and smudged from years of handling. "You ready?" Michael asked. Emma nodded, her grip tightening on the notebook. "Are you?" The drive to Rosehaven felt different this time. The first trip had been clouded with doubt, an obligation Michael had reluctantly taken on. This time, there was purpose. He didn't have all the answers, far from it, but he was beginning to understand the weight of what Margaret had left behind and the responsibility he now carried. Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, the tattered notebook in her lap. She didn't fidget or glance out the window. Her focus stayed fixed on the notebook, as if it contained all the answers they both sought. "What's in there?" Michael asked, breaking the silence. Emma looked up, startled by the question. She hesitated before flipping the notebook open, showing him the pages filled with Margaret's handwriting. It's mostly stories," she said. "Things she wrote down when she visited. Stuff about the other kids. About me." When they arrived at Rosehaven, Claire greeted them at the door. Her warm smile was tempered by a flicker of surprise as she looked between Michael and Emma. "Back so soon?" she asked, stepping aside to let them in. Michael nodded. "I need to understand more about this place, about how it works, what Margaret was doing here, and how I can help. Margaret had so many ideas, but we don't have the resources to make them happen. If you're serious about continuing her work, there's a lot we can do together." Michael leaned closer to Claire. "Does she know these kids?" he asked in a low voice. "Some of them, yes," Claire replied. "But a lot has changed since Margaret passed. Some of the kids moved on and others came in. "This is everything we have on the programs Margaret was working on," she said. She was particularly focused on creating transitional housing for older kids who age out of the system. "What's the biggest challenge you're facing right now?" Michael asked, looking up at Claire. "Funding," she said without hesitation. "We're constantly scraping by. Margaret was our biggest supporter, not just financially but emotionally. She rallied people around us, made them care. Since she's been gone, it's been harder." Margaret hadn't just been a donor, she'd been a presence. To truly honor her, he would need to step into that role, not just as a benefactor, but as a partner. "I want to start by stabilizing the shelter," he said finally. "Make sure you have what you need to keep running. Then we can talk about expanding, maybe opening more locations, building the housing Margaret envisioned." "But are you sure you're ready for something this big?" The small garden outside, where she had planted flowers with the children. Emma followed quietly, her expression unreadable. When they reached the garden, she finally spoke. "She planted those," she said, pointing to a row of bright yellow flowers. She said they were her favorite. She used to spend hours outside, planting, pruning, making everything perfect. It was a monumental task, but for the first time, he felt something other than doubt. He felt resolve. As the city lights came into view, Michael glanced at Emma, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, the notebook still clutched in her hands. Margaret had made a promise to her, and to so many others. Now it was his promise too. The following morning, Michael sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The ideas were all there, swirling in his mind: funding plans, outreach strategies, logistics for expanding Rosehaven's work. But translating those thoughts into actionable steps felt daunting. He rubbed his temples and sighed. The magnitude of what he'd promised to do was finally sinking in. Emma wandered into the study, her footsteps light, but not unnoticed. She hovered near the doorway, clutching Margaret's notebook. Michael glanced up and gestured for her to enter. "You're up early," he said. Emma shrugged and couldn't sleep. She was different. People believed in her, they trusted her. What if you're not enough? Exactly. Michael reached out to his financial team, arranging for a sizable donation to Rosehaven to cover their immediate needs. He also began exploring ways to create a sustainable funding model, reaching out to old business contacts who might be willing to contribute. It wasn't just about money, though. Margaret's work had been built on relationships, something Michael knew he lacked. To fill that gap, he turned to Claire. "You need to be my bridge," he told her during a phone call later that day. "Margaret connected with people in a way I can't. If I'm going to do this, I need your help." "Send me a list," he said. "I'll start reaching out." "There's something I think you should see," she said, opening the notebook to a page near the back. The handwriting was faint, as if Margaret had written it hastily, but the words were clear. Margaret's vision wasn't just about helping children in the moment. It was about giving them the tools and opportunities to build better lives for themselves. "She used to say that all the time," Emma said, her voice soft. She said it was her favorite thing about gardening, watching something small grow into something beautiful. She helped Michael understand the perspective of the children Rosehaven served, offering insights that only someone with first-hand experience could provide. Her quiet strength reminded him of Margaret in ways he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as they reviewed a draft of the new mentorship program, Emma looked up at him. "Do you think she'd be proud?" He didn't know if he was living up to her legacy, but he hoped he was moving in the right direction. "I think she'd be proud of you," he said finally. "You're the reason I'm doing this." Rosehaven's operations stabilized, and new programs started to take shape. The shelter wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, just as Margaret had envisioned. One evening, as Michael stood in the garden outside the mansion, he looked up at the sky and let out a long breath. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there was so much more to do. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Margaret's work hadn't ended with her. It had just begun. Months after Michael had committed to continuing Margaret's legacy, Rosehaven was thriving. The once dwindling shelter now had secure funding, new programs, and a growing reputation in the community. Despite the progress, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The shelter was functional, even innovative, but it didn't have the warmth Margaret had brought to it. He saw the faces of the children who stayed there, grateful, yes, but cautious. They didn't look at him the way they must have looked at Margaret. He was the benefactor, the man who wrote the checks. But he wasn't Margaret. Emma, on the other hand, had begun to soften in ways Michael hadn't anticipated. She spent more time at Rosehaven, helping Claire with the younger kids, or sitting in the garden Margaret had planted with them. Watching her interact with the children made Michael realize just how much Margaret had influenced her life. One evening, as they drove back to the mansion after a long day at Rosehaven, Michael decided to address the unspoken tension between them. "You've been spending a lot of time there," he said, glancing at Emma in the passenger seat. She shrugged. "It feels like her." He had focused so much on stabilizing the shelter's finances and expanding its reach that he'd neglected the human element. He hadn't spent time with the children, hadn't built the kind of relationships that Margaret had made the cornerstone of her work. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've been looking at this like a business, but it's not. It's more than that." For the first time, Michael felt like he might be on the verge of earning her trust. The next day, Michael arrived at Rosehaven unannounced. Claire raised an eyebrow when she saw him standing in the common room, a hesitant but determined look on his face. "I thought you had meetings all day," she said. "They can wait," Michael replied. "I need to be here." It wasn't fear exactly, but the idea of facing the children, of being vulnerable in front of them, made him uneasy. Still, he nodded and headed toward the garden. The scene that greeted him was both chaotic and heartwarming. A group of kids was sprawled across the grass, laughing and chattering as they worked together to plant new flowers. Emma was kneeling beside a young boy, guiding his small hands as he dug a hole for a sapling. Michael stood at the edge of the garden, unsure how to insert himself into the scene. Before he could decide, Emma looked up and spotted him. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "I thought I'd help," Michael said awkwardly. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, she handed him a small trowel and pointed to an empty patch of soil. "You can start there." The kids around him giggled, their laughter infectious. Slowly, Michael found himself relaxing. He wasn't good at this, not yet, but he was trying. One of the younger children, a girl with curly hair and bright eyes, approached him hesitantly. "Are you the man who owns this place?" she asked. Michael paused, the question catching him off guard. "I help run it," he said carefully. "But it's not mine. It's for all of you." Michael looked at her surprised. "You think so?" The air was cool, the stars bright above him. He thought of the children at Rosehaven, of the flowers they had planted together, and of Margaret's unwavering belief in the power of small acts of kindness. He didn't know if he was doing enough or if he ever could. But as he sat there, surrounded by the echoes of Margaret's work, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The following weeks brought a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and surprisingly natural to Michael. His days were spent juggling meetings with donors, coordinating logistics with Claire, and increasingly spending time with the children at Rosehaven. Each interaction, whether in the garden, the reading corner, or the playroom, chipped away at the walls he had built around himself since Margaret's death. Emma, too, had become a constant presence. She accompanied Michael to Rosehaven nearly every day, offering insights that no report or spreadsheet could provide. Her quiet wisdom and occasional bursts of humor reminded him of Margaret in unexpected ways. She had become more than just a reminder of his wife's unfinished work. She had become a partner in it. One day, as Michael sat in his study reviewing the final draft of a proposal for a new mentorship program, Emma appeared in the doorway, her expression unusually serious. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Michael set his pen down and gestured for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" He had been so focused on building Margaret's legacy, on ensuring that Rosehaven thrived, that he hadn't considered what fulfilling her promise to Emma truly meant. He had given the girl a place in his life, yes, but not a home, not in the way Margaret had intended. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I haven't done enough for you." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I don't know yet, but I promise you I'm not going to let you down." He had avoided making decisions about Emma's future, afraid of the implications, the responsibility, but he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. The next morning, he called Claire. "I need your advice," he said as soon as she picked up. Claire's voice was warm but curious. "About what?" "What do I need to do?" At the same time, he made a conscious effort to spend more time with Emma, not just as a caretaker, but as someone she could depend on. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen eating dinner, Emma looked up from her plate and studied him carefully. "You've been different lately," she said. Michael chuckled softly. "Good different or bad different? I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about Margaret's promise." The words Margaret had written, "Every child deserves a chance to grow," felt more significant now than ever. He closed the notebook and set it aside, his heart heavy but hopeful. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, for Emma, for Rosehaven, for Margaret's legacy, and for himself. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the mansion's dining room as Michael sat at the table, staring at the adoption paperwork spread out before him. The crisp documents felt heavier than they looked, each page a reminder of the responsibility he was about to take on. Across the table, Emma poked at her breakfast, her movements unusually subdued. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on her plate. Michael looked up, his expression softening. "I wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't." Her guarded demeanor wasn't new, but today it felt different, like she was holding back something important. Michael wanted to press her, to ask what was on her mind, but he decided to let her come to him on her own terms. "Finish your food," he said instead. "We've got a meeting with the social worker this afternoon." The social worker, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, arrived promptly at 2 o'clock. She had a clipboard in hand and a professional demeanor that bordered on intimidating. As she stepped into the living room, her sharp eyes scanned the space, taking in every detail. "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Carter," Linda said, her tone neutral. "Thank you," Michael replied, gesturing for her to sit. Emma lingered near the edge of the room, her posture stiff and uncomfortable. Linda's assessment was thorough. She asked questions about Michael's work, his daily routine, and his plans for parenting. She walked through the house, noting its size and amenities, and inquired about Michael's support system. Raising a child, especially one with Emma's background, requires more than financial stability, Linda said, her tone professional but firm. It's about emotional availability, consistency, and trust. "I know I can't replace Margaret, but I want to give Emma the stability and support she deserves. But it's important to talk about how you feel, even if it's hard." The smile in the picture was as warm and radiant as he remembered, but now it carried an added weight, a reminder of the life she had envisioned for Emma and the promises he had yet to fulfill. He was pulled from his thoughts by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he called. Emma stepped inside, her expression hesitant. She hovered near the doorway, clutching Margaret's notebook to her chest. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Michael replied, gesturing for her to sit. Emma didn't move. Instead, she looked down at the notebook, her fingers tracing its worn edges. "Do you think she would have done this?" she asked softly. "Adopted me, I mean. I don't want you to do this because of her." She shared stories about her time at Rosehaven, her favorite memories of Margaret, and even her fears about the future. Each conversation deepened Michael's understanding of her and strengthened the bond between them. One evening, as they sat in the garden planting flowers, Emma looked up at Michael and said, "I think she'd be proud of you." He looked at Emma, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun, and felt a swell of emotion he hadn't expected. "I hope so," he said quietly. Emma smiled, a real, genuine smile, and for the first time, Michael felt like they were truly becoming a family. When the final adoption papers were signed, Michael and Emma returned to the mansion in quiet celebration. There was no grand party, no public announcement, just the two of them, sitting at the kitchen table eating ice cream straight from the carton. "You're stuck with me now," Michael said, his tone light, but his eyes warm. Emma smirked. "I guess you'll do." And this time he wasn't walking it alone. The adoption had been finalized for only a week, but life for Michael and Emma was already beginning to take on a new shape. The mansion, once cold and silent, felt different now. Emma's presence brought warmth to the space. Little things like the sound of her laughter from the garden or the way she sprawled on the couch with a book, leaving behind an ever-growing collection of crumbs. Michael, who had spent years walking through the house like a ghost, found himself noticing these changes with a mix of gratitude and adjustment. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but for the first time, the house felt alive. One morning, as Emma sat at the kitchen counter eating cereal, Michael handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she set down her spoon. "Open it and find out," Michael said, leaning back against the counter with a faint smile. Emma tore open the envelope and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. Her eyes widened as she read them. "Tickets?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. "Plane tickets," Michael clarified, "to San Diego. I thought we could use a getaway, and there's a big charity conference there this weekend. It's a chance to meet some of the people Margaret worked with, and for us to spend time together." Michael stayed close, guiding her through security and toward their gate with practiced efficiency. When they finally boarded the plane, Emma pressed her face against the window, watching intently as the ground crew worked below. Michael couldn't help but smile at her wonder. It was a rare glimpse of the childlike curiosity she often kept hidden. As the plane took off, Emma gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles white. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're okay," he said. "The first time is always the weirdest." The first day was all about settling in and exploring the city. They visited the zoo, walked along the beach, and ate dinner at a small cafe overlooking the water. Emma seemed lighter here, her usual guarded demeanor giving way to moments of unrestrained joy. She laughed freely as they watched sea lions bask on the rocks and tried fish tacos for the first time. Michael found himself smiling more than he had in years. "This is nice," Emma said as they walked along the pier that evening, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Michael glanced at her. "It is." Claire had flown in for the event as well, and when she spotted Michael and Emma in the crowd, she beamed. "Look at you two," she said, pulling them into a warm embrace. "You look like a team." Emma stayed close, absorbing everything around her with quiet curiosity. During one of the breaks, an older woman approached them. "You must be Michael Carter," she said, extending a hand. "Margaret talked about you all the time." Margaret's faith in her had been unshakable, and now Michael was determined to uphold that legacy. That evening, as they walked back to the hotel, Emma was unusually quiet. Michael didn't press her, sensing that she needed time to process everything. When they reached their room, she turned to him abruptly. "I think I get it now," she said. Michael frowned. "Get what?" Emma sat by the window again, her head leaning against the glass as she watched the clouds drift by. Michael could see the gears turning in her mind, but he didn't push her to talk. The conference had been an eye-opening experience for both of them, and he knew she needed time to process everything. When the plane landed in Seattle, Emma finally broke the silence. "I think I want to help more," she said abruptly. Michael looked at her, surprised. "Help with what?" "I think it's what she would have wanted." He began meeting regularly with other non-profit leaders, seeking advice on how to expand Rosehaven's reach and create a sustainable model for growth. The work was challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was building something that truly mattered. One afternoon, as Michael reviewed a proposal for a new vocational training program, Emma burst into his study, her eyes alight with excitement. "You have to come see this," she said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. "Emma, I'm in the middle of—" Michael began, but she cut him off. "It'll only take a minute. Come on." "I told them about Margaret's garden, and they wanted to make something like it at the shelter. It wasn't just about the flowers. It was about the sense of community and hope that had grown alongside them." Michael and Emma worked side by side with the children, planting seeds and nurturing them into vibrant blooms. One day, as they watered the garden together, Emma looked up at Michael with an expression of quiet resolve. "Do you ever miss her?" she asked. Michael paused, the question catching him off guard. "Every day," he admitted. "But being here, doing this, it helps. It reminds me of the things she cared about." Together, they would honor Margaret's memory and build something even greater. And for the first time, Michael knew they were ready. The success of the new garden at Rosehaven had sparked a wave of enthusiasm within the shelter. The children, staff, and even some community volunteers had embraced it as more than a patch of flowers. It was a symbol of hope, growth, and renewal. For Michael, it was proof that small efforts could inspire meaningful change. Emma, too, had found her footing. She was no longer just a quiet observer at Rosehaven. She had become an active participant, leading activities, mentoring the younger kids, and even helping Claire organize events. Watching her grow into this role filled Michael with pride, but it also reminded him of the responsibility he carried. One evening, after a particularly productive day at the shelter, Michael sat down with Claire in her small office. "You've done an incredible job with this place," he said, gesturing to the reports on her desk, "but I think we can do more." "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Some were enthusiastic, eager to support a proven concept. Others were more cautious, questioning whether the success of one shelter could be replicated elsewhere. Michael knew the challenges were significant, but he was determined to push forward. He enlisted the help of experts in non-profit management, legal advisors, and even a few of Margaret's former colleagues. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. Emma watched all of this with a mix of curiosity and admiration. One evening, as they sat together in the study, she asked, "Do you think it'll work?" He held meetings to gather their input, asking what they liked most about the shelter and what they thought could be improved. The responses were both insightful and humbling. The kids talked about the sense of safety and belonging they felt at Rosehaven, but they also pointed out areas where the shelter could do better: more books, better meals, and more chances to learn new skills. Michael took their feedback to heart, incorporating it into his plans. He wanted the expansion to reflect the needs and voices of the children it served, not just his own vision. One afternoon, Emma approached Michael with an idea of her own. She held up a drawing she had made, a design for a mural featuring flowers, children, and a tree with Margaret's name etched into the trunk. "I thought maybe we could paint this in the new garden," she said, her voice tentative. "You know, to remember her." "It's beautiful," he said. "I think it's a perfect way to honor her." On the day the mural was unveiled, Michael stood with Emma in front of the crowd that had gathered in the garden. He felt a swell of emotion as he looked at the bright colors and intricate details of the artwork. "This isn't just a mural," Michael said, addressing the group. "It's a reminder of what Margaret believed in, that every child deserves a chance to grow, to thrive, and to find a place where they belong. And it's up to all of us to carry that belief forward." Me too. Michael's phone rarely stopped ringing. Business leaders, philanthropists, and even ordinary community members wanted to be part of what Rosehaven was building. But the success brought new challenges. Michael found himself stretched thin, juggling the day-to-day operations of the shelter with the ambitious plans for expansion. Claire and her staff were invaluable, but as the demands grew, Michael realized they needed more help. One morning, over breakfast, he broached the topic with Emma. "I've been thinking," he said, setting his coffee mug down. "We need more people involved, people who are as passionate about this work as Margaret was. She's really nice and the kids love her. She's always coming up with fun activities." Claire and the staff at Rosehaven were thrilled with the concept, and volunteers from the community stepped up to help with planning and logistics. Emma took charge of brainstorming activities, her excitement infectious. In the weeks leading up to the event, the shelter buzzed with energy. Children made decorations, staff members secured donations, and Michael worked tirelessly to ensure everything went smoothly. It was chaotic, but it was the kind of chaos that reminded everyone why they were there. On the day of the carnival, the garden at Rosehaven was transformed into a vibrant wonderland. Booths lined the paths, offering games, face painting, and snacks. A small stage had been set up for performances, and colorful banners fluttered in the breeze. Emma wandered through the crowd, a clipboard in hand as she checked on each booth. Michael watched her from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. She had grown so much in the past year, stepping into a leadership role with a confidence that reminded him of Margaret. "You've got quite the team," Claire said, coming to stand beside him. Michael nodded, his gaze still on Emma. "I couldn't have done this without her." As the sun began to set, Michael found Emma sitting on a bench near the garden, a tired but content smile on her face. "You did good today," he said, sitting beside her. Emma shrugged, but her smile didn't waver. "It was fun. You think I'm a good teacher?" But instead, she smiled, a bright, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Thanks," she said simply. Michael nodded, his heart full. Together, they had come so far, and he knew their journey was just beginning. The success of the carnival brought a renewed energy to Rosehaven, and for the first time, Michael felt like they were truly creating something Margaret would have been proud of. Yet despite the progress and the growing sense of purpose, there were parts of his past, and Margaret's, that he knew he hadn't fully faced. One morning, as Michael sifted through old documents in his study, he came across a folder labeled Personal Projects, Margaret. He hesitated before opening it, the weight of the memories tied to her name pressing down on him. Inside were handwritten notes, photographs, and a list of names and addresses. One name stood out, Elizabeth Monroe, Portland. Michael frowned, the name stirring a faint memory. He realized it had come up during one of his conversations with Claire, someone Margaret had worked with extensively, but never mentioned to him directly. Driven by curiosity, he decided to follow the lead. "Emma," he called, stepping into the kitchen where she was eating breakfast. "How do you feel about a trip to Portland?" "Another trip? Why?" Michael answered as best he could, though he found himself wondering just how much he still didn't know about his wife's life outside of their home. When they arrived at the address from Margaret's notes, Michael was surprised to find a small, cozy house with a neatly tended garden. It felt worlds away from the bustling activity of Rosehaven. An older woman opened the door, her sharp blue eyes softening when Michael introduced himself. "You're Margaret's husband," she said, her voice tinged with both recognition and sadness. "I've been wondering if I'd ever hear from you." As they sat down, she began to talk about Margaret's passion for helping children, her tireless dedication to creating safe spaces, and her unwavering belief in the power of community. "She had a way of seeing the best in people," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion, "even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Oh, she talked about you all the time. She was so proud of you, Emma. She used to say you had more strength than most adults she knew. Protective of you, Michael. She didn't want to burden you with the darker parts of her work. She thought she could handle it on her own. She had wanted to shield him, to protect him from the pain she so willingly faced for others. What can I do to honor her work?" he asked after a long pause. Elizabeth smiled softly. "You're already doing it, but if you want to go further, listen to the people she cared about. They'll guide you." "I've been thinking about what Elizabeth said, about Margaret carrying the weight by herself." That evening, as they sat in the garden at the mansion, Michael looked out at the flowers, their vibrant colors softened by the twilight. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "Margaret believed in planting seeds, not just in the garden, but in people. She believed that even the smallest act of kindness could grow into something bigger. And I'm going to make sure you have everything you need to grow. Rosehaven expanded its programs, with new partnerships forming in nearby cities. Michael worked tirelessly, channeling the skills he had once used to build his business empire into something far more meaningful. Emma, too, had become an integral part of the shelter's day-to-day life, bridging the gap between the children and the adults who sought to help them. But as much as they moved forward, Margaret's presence was never far from their minds. Her legacy wasn't just a guiding force. It was the foundation on which they were building something new. One evening, as Michael prepared for a fundraising gala he had organized to support Rosehaven's expansion, Emma appeared in the doorway of his study. "You look nervous," she said, her tone teasing. Michael chuckled, straightening his tie. "I'm not great with crowds." "Fair point. Ready to go?" The room buzzed with energy as donors mingled, staff members shared stories, and Rosehaven's successes were proudly displayed in photos and videos. Emma stayed close to Michael, her eyes wide as she took in the elegant surroundings. It was a far cry from the shelter's humble garden, but the purpose behind it was the same. As the evening progressed, Michael took the stage to address the crowd. The room quieted as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "When my wife Margaret started her work with Rosehaven, she believed that every child deserved a chance to grow. She planted the seeds of something extraordinary, something that has touched more lives than I ever could have imagined. But I've learned that the best way to honor her legacy is not by trying to replace her, but by building on what she started. And I couldn't have done it alone." Michael rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she stood beside him. "This is Emma," he said. "She was one of the children Margaret worked with directly. And today, she's not just a part of Rosehaven, she's a leader. She's proof of what Margaret believed in, that with love and support, every child can thrive." As the applause died down, Michael continued, "This is what your support makes possible. It's not just about keeping the lights on, it's about changing lives. And together we can expand that vision, bringing hope and opportunity to even more children." "You didn't tell me you were going to do that," she said, nudging him playfully. Michael shrugged. "I wanted to surprise you." And through it all, he and Emma had found each other. A family built not by blood but by love, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest seeds could bloom into something extraordinary.